Emily Reed sat in a small cafe in downtown New York, her fingers anxiously tapping the cover of a worn-out notebook. Her auburn hair fell messily over her shoulders, and she looked like a perfect blend of determination and uncertainty. Her gaze was focused on the bustling street outside, but her mind was elsewhere, on Blake Taylor, the man who had recently entered her life with a sudden and overwhelming force. Blake, a towering figure in the publishing world, was everything Emily wasn't: wealthy, influential, and confident. He had been captivated by Emily's raw talent during a writing workshop he had attended as a guest speaker. Unlike most of the attendees who were there for recognition, Emily was there to survive. Her stories were born from hardship, crafted from sleepless nights and the gritty reality of life in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. Their first conversation had been unexpected. After the workshop ended, Blake had approached her with a smile that seemed too charming to be genuine. "Your words have a fire," he had said, his blue eyes piercing hers. "I'd like to help you bring them to a larger audience." Emily's instincts had warned her to be cautious, but the pull was undeniable. There was something in Blake's gaze that promised more than just a business opportunity. It was a spark, a dangerous one that had the potential to set her entire world ablaze. Now, weeks later, Emily found herself deeply entangled with him. Their connection was intense, exhilarating, and yet laced with secrecy. Blake, despite his public bravado, was a man of hidden depths. He had a complicated relationship with his family, one defined by old money, expectations, and an image that had to be meticulously preserved. "Emily," he had told her one evening, his voice low and serious, "we have to be discreet. It's not just my reputation. There are people who wouldn't understand us, or what we have." At first, Emily had agreed. The thrill of sneaking around, of secretive meetings in dimly lit corners of expensive restaurants, was intoxicating. But as the weeks turned into months, the strain of their clandestine romance began to weigh on her. She wanted more time, more honesty, more of Blake. One evening, as they lay in his luxurious Manhattan penthouse, Emily felt the urge to confront him. "Why are we hiding, Blake?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you so afraid of?" Blake's jaw tightened, a familiar sign of his inner turmoil. "It's complicated, Emily. You know that. Is it your family? Your image?" she pressed, feeling the frustration rise within her. "Or is it me? Am I not good enough for you to be seen with?" His eyes flashed with anger, but there was also a hint of something softer, perhaps guilt, or maybe regret. "It's not about you," he insisted. "It's about everything that comes with me. You deserve more than to be dragged into that mess." But Emily didn't want to be protected. She wanted to be chosen, fully and without hesitation. And in that moment, she realized that Blake, for all his allure and power, was a man deeply shackled by his own fears. As she walked home that night, the chilly autumn air biting at her skin, Emily felt a familiar pang of loneliness. Blake was the most exhilarating thing that had ever happened to her, but he was also the most elusive. And the question that lingered in her mind was whether she could continue loving a man who seemed unwilling to love her openly. But she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the scared, struggling writer she had been when they first met. She was stronger now, and she was prepared to fight for what she wanted, even if it meant risking heartbreak. Blake Taylor stood in his spacious office, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline. The city's lights glittered against the darkness, a sight he usually found empowering. Tonight, however, it was only a reminder of the chaos brewing inside him. "Cancel my dinner plans," Blake instructed his assistant over the phone. His voice was firm, but a hint of frustration seeped through. "Yes, Mr. Taylor," the assistant replied, accustomed to Blake's unpredictable schedule. Blake tossed his phone onto his mahogany desk and ran a hand through his neatly styled hair. The truth was, he wasn't merely canceling dinner. He was trying to buy time to think, to strategize, to justify what he was about to do. The decision weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't afford hesitation. Earlier that day, Blake had received disturbing news about Emily's family. An investigator he had hired to discreetly check on her background had uncovered the truth. Emily's mother was gravely ill, and the family's debts were escalating beyond control. It was clear that Emily had been struggling far more than she had let on. Blake's initial reaction had been a mixture of anger and concern. Anger that Emily hadn't been honest with him, and concern for the woman he secretly cherished. But it was more than just her silence that troubled him. It was the fact that her situation could potentially expose him to public scrutiny if their relationship were ever revealed. He knew how the media would twist the narrative. A powerful magnate taking advantage of a young woman in financial distress. It would be a scandal, one his family and partners wouldn't tolerate. Blake had tried to distance himself from his family's rigid expectations for years, but the pressure had never truly lifted. He could hear his father's voice in his mind, cold and judgmental. "You represent the Taylors, Blake. Your choices affect all of us." The weight of that legacy was crushing. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant breaking both of their hearts. He had to let her go. The decision solidified in his mind, but his heart felt like it was being ripped apart. He couldn't bear to face Emily and watch her confusion turn into hurt. Cowardly, perhaps, but it seemed kinder than a confrontation. So, Blake did what he did best. He built a wall, high and unyielding, around himself. That evening, Emily waited for Blake in a small Italian restaurant they had chosen as one of their secret meeting spots. The cozy ambience, with its warm lighting and scent of fresh pasta, had always felt like an oasis for them. One of the few places where they could be just Blake and Emily, not a billionaire and an aspiring writer. But as the minutes turned into hours, Emily's hopeful smile began to fade. Her calls went unanswered, and her texts were marked as read but without a response. Panic and confusion surged through her. Finally, unable to bear the awkward stares of the waitstaff any longer, Emily gathered her things and left the restaurant. She made her way to Blake's building, hoping for some explanation. The doorman recognized her and let her in, but as she approached Blake's penthouse door, she was met with cold silence. She knocked, first softly, then with increasing urgency. Still, no answer. Her heart raced as the reality sank in. Blake wasn't avoiding her. He was shutting her out completely. Back on the cold streets of Manhattan, Emily felt a strange mix of numbness and despair. She replayed every moment they had shared, trying to decipher what had gone wrong. She had always known Blake's world was different from hers, but she had believed in the strength of their connection. For days, Emily remained hopeful that Blake would reach out with some explanation, perhaps even an apology. But the silence persisted. It was as if Blake Taylor had vanished from her life as swiftly as he had entered it. Determined not to crumble under the weight of rejection, Emily poured herself into her writing. It was the only place where she felt she still had control. Her pain bled into her words, giving her stories a raw, palpable intensity. Months later, Emily's hard work paid off when a small publishing house accepted her latest manuscript. It wasn't a large advance, but it was enough to cover some of her family's debts. And more importantly, it was proof that she could survive without Blake Taylor. Still, late at night, when the city was quiet and her apartment felt emptier than usual, Emily couldn't help but wonder if Blake had ever really cared. The question haunted her, gnawing at the corners of her resolve. But she had learned one thing for sure. She was no longer the same Emily Reed who had fallen for a man with a guarded heart. She was stronger, fiercer, and she was determined to build her own path, even if it meant doing so without the man she once thought she loved. 3 years had passed since the last time Emily Reed had seen Blake Taylor. The memories had faded, but they were never truly gone. She had spent those years pouring her pain, anger, and lingering love into her writing. Every word she wrote seemed to carry a piece of him, a shadow of their past that she couldn't quite erase. And now, Emily found herself on the verge of something she had only dreamed about. Her book was becoming a bestseller. It was called Beneath the Gilded Lies, a tale of passion, betrayal, and secrets that lingered in the halls of wealth and power. While fictional, the story was deeply personal, carrying echoes of her own experiences with Blake. The launch party for the book was held in a stylish venue in Soho, filled with editors, literary critics, and enthusiastic readers. Emily stood at the center of the room, surrounded by applause and praise. For the first time in years, She felt a sense of validation, a triumph she had long sought. "Emily, this is just the beginning," her agent, Vanessa, exclaimed with excitement. "Everyone's talking about the mysterious triple boys in the story. They're such a compelling part of the narrative. Where did you get the inspiration for them?" Emily's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The triple boys, as they were being called, were three enigmatic characters in her novel, each representing different aspects of loss, abandonment, and the search for identity. They were born out of a painful part of her own past that Emily could hardly explain, even to herself. "Just fragments of a dream," Emily replied vaguely, not wanting to dive into the details. Vanessa nodded, seemingly satisfied, but her gaze lingered curiously on Emily, sensing there was more behind the words than the author was letting on. Meanwhile, across town, Blake Taylor sat in his luxurious office, flipping through the pages of a magazine. His eyes landed on a headline that made his heart skip a beat. "Beneath the Gilded Lies Takes the Literary World by Storm." The article featured a photograph of Emily, radiant and confident, holding her book. Blake's chest tightened. He hadn't expected to see her like this, successful, thriving, and entirely out of his reach. He hadn't read the book yet, but he had heard about its popularity. Curiosity, mixed with a sense of unease, gnawed at him. It was a story he couldn't ignore, even if he wanted to. On a cold October night, after a long day of meetings and negotiations, Blake finally decided to read the book. He settled into his leather armchair, a glass of bourbon in hand, and began to turn the pages. At first, the story seemed to be a familiar tale of love and betrayal among the elite. But as he read further, a strange feeling of recognition crept over him. The characters' words, the settings, even the emotions, they all seemed eerily personal. Then came the chapter about the triple boys. The story described three young boys, each born under mysterious circumstances, each marked by a sense of abandonment. Blake's hands trembled as he read on. There was something deeply unsettling about this part of the story, something that resonated with a hidden truth from his own past that he had never spoken about, not even to Emily. By the time he reached the end of the book, Blake felt exposed, as if Emily had peeled away the layers he had carefully constructed around his life. He couldn't shake off the suspicion that she knew more about his past than he had ever intended to reveal. How could she have written such intimate details? And why had she chosen to focus so intensely on the story of the three boys? Blake's mind raced as he considered his options. This wasn't just a book. It was a direct challenge, a public declaration that threatened to reveal secrets he had buried long ago. Driven by anger and fear, Blake made a decision. He reached for his phone and dialed the number of his lawyer, Jonathan. "Jonathan," Blake said, his voice cold and determined, "I need you to file a defamation lawsuit against Emily Reed. It's about her new book. Are you sure about this, Blake?" Jonathan asked cautiously. A legal battle could draw more attention to the story. "Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" Blake hesitated for a moment, but then his resolve hardened. "I am. She crossed a line, and I won't let her get away with it." The news of the lawsuit hit Emily like a punch to the stomach. She had woken up to a barrage of calls from journalists, her publisher, and even friends she hadn't heard from in years. The media frenzy was relentless, filled with speculation and rumors. Emily's personal life was once again under a harsh spotlight, and this time it was worse. This time, it was war. Vanessa, Emily's agent, tried to keep her calm. "We can fight this, Emily," she insisted. "It's clear that your book is a work of fiction. Blake doesn't have a case." But Emily was less certain. She knew the book was based on real emotions and events, even if the characters were fictionalized. The lawsuit was a brutal reminder of the power Blake still held over her life. And as the legal battle began to unfold, Emily realized that this wasn't just about the book. It was about the unfinished business between them, the unresolved wounds and secrets that had never been fully addressed. One evening, as Emily sat in her lawyer's office, she couldn't help but wonder if Blake's actions were driven purely by anger, or if there was something deeper at play. Did he still care, in some twisted way? Or was this his final attempt to control her, to dictate the terms of their story? As the legal drama escalated, so did the tension between Emily and Blake. But beneath the hostility and bitterness, there remained a lingering connection, a sense of unfinished business that neither of them could deny. And as the trial loomed closer, Emily knew that she was about to face Blake once again, not as a lover, but as an adversary. The courtroom was packed, filled with a mix of reporters, curious onlookers, and a few familiar faces from the publishing world. The air buzzed with tension, the kind that only a high-profile trial could generate. At the center of it all were Emily Reed and Blake Taylor, facing each other for the first time in years. Emily sat beside her lawyer, trying to steady her breathing. Her dark hair was pulled back, exposing the determination in her eyes, but also a hint of vulnerability. She knew this wasn't just a battle over her book. This was a confrontation with her past, a past she had tried so hard to move beyond. Blake, on the opposite side of the room, appeared stoic. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, his expression revealing little. He was surrounded by his legal team, all dressed sharply, their briefcases filled with documents meant to dismantle Emily's case. But beneath Blake's calm exterior, there was a turmoil he couldn't shake. Seeing Emily again, especially under these circumstances, was more unsettling than he'd anticipated. The first day of the trial began with Blake's lawyer presenting their argument. Jonathan, a seasoned litigator, spoke with the confidence of someone who had won many cases before. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge with authority, "this case is not simply about a novel. It is about a deliberate attempt to tarnish my client's reputation by drawing parallels between the fictional characters and Mr. Taylor's real-life circumstances. We have reason to believe that the details about the so-called Triple Boys were intended to reflect personal matters known only to Ms. Reed." Emily's lawyer, Christine, was a formidable presence in her own right. She stood tall and spoke with conviction. "Your Honor," Christine countered, "the book in question is a work of fiction. While the author draws upon personal experiences, as most writers do, the characters and events are entirely fictionalized. Mr. Taylor's claims are speculative and an attempt to silence creative expression." As the opening arguments concluded, Emily felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She caught Blake's gaze across the room, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had rewound, taking them back to the days when their relationship had been filled with passion and hope. But the courtroom's cold atmosphere quickly pulled her back to reality. The days that followed were filled with testimonies, expert opinions, and heated cross-examinations. Journalists swarmed outside the courthouse each day, eager to capture the latest developments. The trial was quickly becoming a media circus, with headlines splashed across newspapers and gossip sites. Billionaire versus best-selling author. A battle for the truth. One afternoon, Emily took the stand. Christine guided her gently through the questions, allowing her to tell her side of the story. "I never intended to harm Blake," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My book was about my own journey, my own pain. Yes, there are elements inspired by real life, but that is the nature of writing. It was never meant to be a weapon against him." Jonathan, Blake's lawyer, rose for the cross-examination. His questions were pointed, designed to corner Emily and expose contradictions. "Ms. Reed," he said sharply, "you claim that the story is fictional. Yet, isn't it true that the character of the powerful businessman bears a striking resemblance to Mr. Taylor? And that the Triple Boys seem eerily similar to details of Mr. Taylor's past, which are not publicly known?" Emily's heart raced. She had anticipated these questions, but hearing them spoken aloud made everything feel more real, more dangerous. "The businessman in my book represents a type of person, not a specific individual," she responded carefully. "And as for the boys, they are symbolic. An embodiment of the pain of abandonment, something I have experienced personally." Blake watched Emily closely as she spoke. There was a raw honesty in her voice, one that stirred something deep within him. He had always admired her passion, her fearlessness. Now, as she faced his accusations head-on, he felt a pang of regret, wondering if he had been too hasty in pursuing legal action. But his pride and fear of exposure kept him committed to the battle. The turning point of the trial came when Christine called an unexpected witness, one of Blake's former nannies from his childhood. The elderly woman, frail but with a clear voice, shared a story that stunned the courtroom. Blake was always a sensitive boy, she began, glancing at Blake with a hint of sadness. He had a difficult childhood, and there were 3 children in his life. Triplets, actually. They were his half-brothers, from an affair his father had. The boys were sent away, and Blake was told never to speak of them. A collective gasp swept through the room. Emily's eyes widened in shock. She had never known this about Blake's past. She had written about the Triple boys as a metaphor, never realizing that it was rooted in an actual truth from Blake's life. The revelation hit Blake like a blow. His carefully guarded secret, one that he had tried to bury, was now laid bare before the world. The judge called for a brief recess, giving everyone a moment to process the unexpected testimony. Blake remained seated, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. Emily, still reeling from the discovery, felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She hadn't meant to dredge up real pain. She had only wanted to tell her story, to heal her wounds. When the trial resumed, Blake surprised everyone by requesting to take the stand. He looked determined, but there was also a vulnerability in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor," Blake began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I started this lawsuit to protect my privacy, to protect a part of my life that I never wanted exposed. But what I didn't realize was that in trying to silence Emily, I was also denying a part of myself. The truth is, the story of the Triple boys does reflect my past, in a way I never anticipated. Emily couldn't have known the real details. She couldn't have known the real pain." His words hung in the air, a mixture of confession and regret. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Blake. Emily's heart ached as she listened, sensing that this was the most honest Blake had ever been. "I don't want to continue this lawsuit," Blake said finally. "Not because I've lost, but because I've realized that I'm still haunted by things I never dealt with. Emily's book forced me to confront those ghosts." The judge nodded solemnly, taking in Blake's unexpected admission. Emily felt tears prick her eyes, not from victory, but from a strange sense of closure that was beginning to form between them. As the trial concluded, the media erupted with reactions to Blake's testimony. It was clear that the lawsuit had revealed more than either of them had anticipated. And as Emily and Blake stood outside the courtroom, facing each other without lawyers or judges, there was a heavy silence. "I'm sorry," Blake said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I never meant for it to come to this." Emily searched his eyes, seeing the man she had loved, but also seeing someone new, someone more real, more broken. "So am I," she replied. "But maybe we both needed this, to finally understand." Blake nodded, unsure of what the future held, but certain that this chapter of their story had finally reached its end. The trial might have ended, but the aftershocks lingered. Emily Reed found herself in a whirlwind of media frenzy, interviews, and intense public scrutiny. Her book sales skyrocketed in the wake of the lawsuit's publicity, but the victory felt hollow. The courtroom had revealed things she wasn't prepared to confront, about Blake, about her writing, and about her own motivations. In the quiet of her apartment, Emily often found herself lost in thought. She gazed at the framed cover of Beneath the Gilded Lies on her wall, a reminder of her achievement, but also of the painful journey that had led her there. Blake's revelation about the triplets had been a shocking twist, one she still struggled to comprehend. It had felt like an eerie coincidence, as if her writing had somehow tapped into a hidden truth, one that was never hers to uncover. Meanwhile, Blake Taylor was also trying to make sense of what had happened. The trial had forced him to confront a part of his past that he had buried so deeply, even he had started to believe it was gone. The revelation of his half-brothers, the triplets, had reopened old wounds, ones tied to his father's affair and the subsequent scandal that had almost destroyed the Taylor family's image. He had spent his entire life distancing himself from that legacy, only to have it resurface in the most unexpected of ways. Blake found himself drawn to Emily's book again, this time reading it with a different perspective. He wasn't searching for parallels to his life. Instead, he was trying to understand her pain, her struggles, and what had driven her to write such a story. As he turned the pages, he saw a reflection of his own loneliness mirrored in her words. It was both haunting and comforting, a strange sense of connection that he couldn't shake off. One evening, as Emily sat by her window with a glass of wine, her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a familiar name, Blake Taylor. She hadn't heard from him since the trial ended, and seeing his name now sent a jolt through her. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready for whatever this conversation might bring. But curiosity, mixed with a lingering sense of unfinished business, drove her to answer. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Emily." Blake's voice came through, steady but with a hint of vulnerability. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "It's fine," she replied, her heart beating faster. "What's on your mind?" Blake paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. I wanted to apologize. I know that's not enough, but it's all I have right now." Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "It's not just about the lawsuit, Blake. It's about everything that came before it. How you left, the way you shut me out without any explanation." Blake's voice softened. "I know. I was a coward back then. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just protecting myself. I was too afraid to face my own mess, so I ran." Emily felt a familiar ache in her chest, the one that always appeared when she thought about how things had ended between them. "I never understood why you didn't just tell me the truth," she said quietly. "Even if it was painful, I would have rather known." "It's complicated," Blake admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "The truth wasn't just about us. It was about my family, my past, and things I was never able to accept. But seeing everything laid out in court, it made me realize that I can't keep running from it." For a long moment, there was silence between them. It wasn't the hostile silence that had defined the courtroom, nor was it the tense silence of their breakup. This was different, a pause filled with a sense of honesty that had long been missing from their conversations. "Why are you calling me, Blake?" Emily finally asked, her voice steady but tinged with genuine curiosity. I'm trying to understand," Blake said slowly. "I want to know if there's a chance for us to have a real conversation, one without lawyers or secrets." Emily's grip tightened around her phone. Part of her wanted to shut him out, to protect herself from any further pain. But another part, a part she couldn't quite suppress, was intrigued by the possibility of closure, or perhaps even something more. "I don't know if we can go back," Emily said honestly. "Too much has happened." Blake's response was immediate. "I'm not asking to go back. I'm asking if we can start over, this time with honesty." Emily didn't answer right away. The idea of starting over, after everything that had happened, felt daunting. But there was also a small spark of hope, one that had survived despite all the bitterness and anger. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it won't be easy." "I don't expect it to be," Blake replied. "But I'd rather face the hard truth than live with lies again." The call ended with no promises, just an understanding that perhaps there was a path forward, even if it was uncertain. Over the following weeks, Emily and Blake began to rebuild a tentative connection. It started with small gestures, an unexpected email, a text message asking about her next book project. The conversations were cautious at first, each one a step toward regaining the trust that had been shattered. One chilly November afternoon, Blake invited Emily to meet him at a quiet cafe near Central Park, the same place where they had first shared coffee years ago. Emily hesitated at the invitation, but eventually agreed. She arrived a few minutes early, her nerves a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. When Blake walked in, his gaze immediately found hers. He approached with a smile that was both familiar and new, a sign of the man he had become after everything they had endured. "Thanks for coming," he said, taking a seat across from her. "I almost didn't," Emily admitted, "but I figured it was time we actually talked, face to face." The conversation that followed was honest and raw. They spoke of the past, but without the bitterness that had clouded their previous encounters. Blake opened up about his childhood, the secrets he had carried, and how they had shaped his decisions, especially with Emily. "I never wanted you to be part of my mess," he confessed. "But I see now that you were never the problem. I was." Emily nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. "I'm glad you finally see that," she said. "But you need to know that I'm different now. I'm not the same person who fell in love with you back then." Blake's gaze was steady. I wouldn't want you to be. And I'm not the same either. As they left the cafe, they took a walk through Central Park, the crisp autumn air filled with the promise of change. It wasn't a romantic reconciliation, nor was it a dramatic resolution. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one built on the possibility of honesty, forgiveness, and perhaps, one day, love. For the first time in years, Emily felt a sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held with Blake, but she knew that whatever came next, it would be on her own terms. The days grew shorter as winter set in, wrapping New York City in a chilly embrace. Emily Reed tried to settle into a routine, one that now included sporadic meetings and calls with Blake Taylor. Their interactions had shifted from confrontation to something approaching friendship, but there was an unspoken tension beneath the surface. It was a mix of unfinished emotions and unaddressed questions about the past, about the 3 lost boys from Blake's life, and about whether they were truly capable of rebuilding anything meaningful. One December morning, Emily was in the middle of revising her next manuscript when she received an unexpected message from Blake. "Can we meet tonight? I have something important to share." There was no hint of his usual formality. The message was direct, almost urgent. Emily's heart fluttered with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She agreed, and they arranged to meet at a small bar on the Upper West Side, a place far removed from the glamorous venues Blake usually frequented. When Emily arrived, she found Blake already seated at a dimly lit table in the corner, his face etched with seriousness. "Thanks for coming," he said as she approached, standing briefly before gesturing for her to sit. "Of course," Emily replied, trying to read the expression in his eyes. "What's going on, Blake?" He took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for a difficult confession. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the trial," he began. "Not just about us, but about those 3 boys." Emily tensed at the mention of them, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "The triplets," she said quietly. "I never knew the truth, Blake. It was never meant to be about your real brothers." "I know," Blake said, his voice softening. "But after everything that came out in court, I couldn't stop thinking about them. I've tried to bury that part of my life for so long, but I realized I need answers. Answers I've been running from for years." He paused, looking down at the drink in front of him before meeting Emily's gaze. "I'm going to find them, Emily. I've already started the search." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emily felt a surge of unexpected emotion, hope, sadness, and a deep sense of empathy for Blake's journey. "Do you think you'll be able to find them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Blake admitted, "but I have to try. I owe it to them and to myself." Emily nodded, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and sorrow for the man sitting across from her. He was still the powerful, guarded Blake Taylor she had known, but there was something different now, a vulnerability she had never seen before. "What will you do if you find them?" she asked, genuinely curious about what this search meant for him. Blake's eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't know if they'll want anything to do with me," he said honestly, "but at least I'll have tried. At least I'll know I didn't just let them disappear without a trace." For the first time since their relationship had begun, Emily saw Blake not as the untouchable magnate, but as a man deeply marked by his past, someone struggling to reconcile the pieces of a broken family. It stirred something within her, a tenderness that she had tried to suppress for so long. "I hope you find them," she said sincerely, "and I hope it brings you the peace you've been looking for." Blake reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything. For writing the book, for forcing me to face things I never had the courage to confront." Emily's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "I never wanted to hurt you, Blake," she said, "but I needed to tell my story, even if it meant revisiting painful memories." "I understand that now," Blake replied, "and I think I needed to hear it." As the evening progressed, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. They reminisced about their early days, laughing over shared memories that seemed so distant now. For a brief moment, it felt like the walls between them had finally crumbled, leaving only 2 people who had once loved each other and were now trying to understand what remained. But the search for the triplets had only just begun. Blake's decision to find them set off a series of events that neither of them could have anticipated. As weeks passed, Emily found herself increasingly drawn into Blake's quest. He shared updates with her, fragments of information gathered by private investigators, leads that sometimes turned into dead ends, and occasional breakthroughs that filled him with a mix of hope and dread. One night, Blake called Emily with news that left her stunned. "I think we've found them," he said, his voice barely concealing his excitement. "At least 2 of them." Emily's heart raced. "Where?" "Upstate New York," Blake replied. "They were adopted by different families, but 2 of them ended up in the same town. I'm planning to drive up there next week." Emily hesitated before speaking. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked, unsure of whether her presence would help or complicate things. Blake paused, clearly taken aback by the offer. "Would you really do that?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. "If it would make it easier for you," Emily said honestly. "I know this is something you need to do on your own, but you don't have to be alone when you face it." Blake was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "I'd like that," he admitted. "More than you know." The following week, they made the trip upstate together. The drive was filled with nervous anticipation, the kind that made even small talk feel strained. As they neared the town where the 2 brothers were believed to live, Blake's anxiety was palpable. His usual calm demeanor had given way to a mix of fear and hope, and Emily could sense how much this moment meant to him. When they arrived, Blake parked the car outside a modest, suburban house. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle. Emily placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Whatever happens, you've come this far," she said softly. "That's already a big step." Blake nodded, drawing strength from her words. "Let's do this," he said, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. They approached the house slowly, each step feeling like a step toward an uncertain future. Blake knocked on the door, and they waited in silence, the sound of their own breathing filling the cold winter air. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a wary expression. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone cautious. Blake's voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability beneath it. "My name is Blake Taylor," he said. "I believe I might be your brother." The man's eyes widened, shock and confusion flashing across his face. He seemed to struggle for words, as if unsure whether to believe what he was hearing. I think you should come inside," he said finally, stepping aside to let them enter. As they crossed the threshold, Emily watched Blake closely, her heart aching for him. This was the moment he had been seeking, but it was also the beginning of a journey filled with unknowns. Inside, they sat down in a small living room, the air thick with tension and unspoken questions. Blake's brother, one of the lost triplets, looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "So, you're really him," the man said slowly, still trying to process the reality. "We always wondered if we'd ever find you." Blake's eyes were filled with emotion. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said, his voice breaking. "I just didn't know how to find you. Until now." Emily watched as the 2 brothers began to share their stories, piecing together fragments of a shattered past. It was a moment of reconciliation, not just for Blake, but for the family he had lost and was now trying to rebuild. For Emily, it was a reminder of the power of truth, even when it was painful. And as she sat beside Blake, she felt a sense of closure, not just for their past, but for the parts of themselves that had been broken by secrets and silence. Winter had settled firmly over New York, painting the city in shades of gray. Emily Reed, back in her small apartment, found herself reflecting on the recent trip upstate with Blake. It had been one of the most intense experiences of her life, watching Blake reunite with one of his lost brothers. The meeting had been raw and awkward, but beneath the initial shock, there was a sense of cautious hope. In the days that followed, Blake struggled to process everything that had come to light. His brother's name was Caleb, and he was a quiet man who seemed to carry the same guarded vulnerability that Blake often did. Their first few conversations had been filled with tentative questions, each one uncovering painful fragments of their shared past. Emily felt both drawn to and distanced from Blake during this time. She wanted to support him, but she knew that this was a journey he had to navigate largely on his own. Their phone calls became more frequent, though, and each conversation carried an unexpected intimacy. It wasn't the romantic tension they had once shared, but rather the raw, unfiltered honesty of two people who had been through hell and were now trying to make sense of it all. One evening, Blake called unexpectedly. "Emily," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant. "There's something I need to talk to you about, in person." Emily's heart quickened, uncertainty flooding her. "Of course," she said. "Where do you want to meet?" "Would you mind coming to my place?" he asked. "I think it would be easier." Emily agreed, though a part of her wondered what he could possibly need to say that required this level of privacy. When she arrived at Blake's penthouse, the memories of their past flooded back, the secretive dinners, the stolen moments of intimacy, and the walls of wealth that had once felt like barriers between them. Blake greeted her at the door, his expression serious but warm. "Thanks for coming," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked, her tone gentle but filled with concern. Blake led her to the living room, where they sat on opposite ends of a large, leather couch. "I found the third brother," he announced, his voice surprisingly calm. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "You did? Where?" "He's in California," Blake explained. "His name is Luke. I've spoken to him on the phone and he seems open to meeting." Emily tried to process the information, her mind racing with questions. "That's amazing, Blake," she said sincerely. "How do you feel about it?" Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that Emily recognized as one of stress. "It's a lot to take in," he admitted. "Caleb and I are still trying to figure things out, and now there's Luke. It's overwhelming, but I can't stop now. I need to see this through." There was a pause, a moment heavy with unspoken thoughts. Emily sensed there was more to what Blake wanted to say. "Emily," he began, his voice softer, "I've been thinking a lot about everything we went through about us." The words hung in the air, charged with a mix of nostalgia and unresolved feelings. Emily's chest tightened. She had been preparing herself for this conversation for months, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure how to respond. "I've thought about it too," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were." Blake nodded slowly. "I'm not asking to go back," he said. "I know too much has changed, but I also know that I never stopped caring about you, even when I tried to convince myself that I had." Emily's eyes shimmered with emotion, a blend of anger, sadness, and lingering affection. "You hurt me, Blake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And it wasn't just the breakup. It was the way you abandoned everything without a word, as if I didn't matter." Blake's expression was filled with regret. "I know," he said. "I was a coward, and I'm sorry for everything I put you through. I wish I could change the past, but all I can do now is try to be better in the present." Emily looked away, fighting back tears. The wounds were still fresh, even after all this time. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said honestly. "Not in the same way." Blake reached across the table, his hand resting inches away from hers. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect things to magically go back to the way they were. But I'm willing to try if you are." Emily considered his words carefully. There was a sincerity in his voice that hadn't been there before, a rawness that made her believe he was genuinely trying to change. But the scars were deep, and she wasn't sure if she could open herself up to him again, not without risking more pain. "I need time," she finally said. "I can't just jump back into something without knowing if it's real this time." Blake nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of understanding and longing. "I'll give you all the time you need," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." The conversation ended without any grand declarations, but there was a quiet sense of possibility in the air, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something new from the ashes of the past. In the following weeks, Blake continued his efforts to reconnect with his brothers. He made plans to visit Luke in California, hoping to establish a bond that had been lost for decades. Caleb, meanwhile, began to open up more, sharing stories of their childhood that Blake had never known. Emily watched from a distance, her own life slowly finding a new rhythm. Her next book was taking shape, though she struggled to keep the past from bleeding into the pages. Despite her best efforts to stay focused, Blake remained a constant presence in her mind. She found herself wondering about his progress, about whether he would find the closure he so desperately sought. One evening, as Emily sat in her apartment revising a chapter, her phone rang. It was Blake. "Hey," he said when she answered, his voice sounding lighter than it had in months. "I just got back from California." Emily's heart lifted at the news. "How was it?" she asked eagerly. "It was complicated," Blake admitted, "but good." Luke was hesitant at first, but we managed to have a real conversation. "There's still a lot to work through, but I think we're on the right path." Emily smiled, genuinely happy for him. "I'm glad to hear that, Blake. I really am." There was a pause on the line. The kind that usually meant something deeper was about to be said. "Emily," Blake began, his tone serious but hopeful, "I want you to know that finding my brothers has made me realize something important. I don't want to lose the chance to be honest with you, to make things right between us. Whatever that might mean." Emily's chest tightened, a mixture of fear and hope coursing through her. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Blake," she said honestly, "but I do know that I don't want to lose you completely. Maybe we can figure it out one step at a time." Blake's voice was filled with a quiet determination. "I'd like that," he said simply. As they hung up, Emily felt a sense of unexpected calm. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, nor was it a promise of forever. But it was real, and it was enough for now. Spring slowly crept into New York City, bringing with it a sense of renewal that Emily Reed felt in her own life. The crisp air was replaced by milder breezes, and the barren trees began to sprout new leaves. Yet, despite the signs of change around her, Emily found herself wrestling with a familiar uncertainty, the delicate, fragile connection she had with Blake Taylor. It had been nearly 2 months since Blake's trip to California, and while their conversations had become more frequent, the tension between them remained. Emily's heart was caught in a confusing dance between hope and caution. She wanted to believe that Blake's transformation was real, that his quest to reunite with his brothers was leading him to a better version of himself. But the scars of their past kept her guarded. One bright April morning, as Emily was preparing to leave for a book signing event, her phone rang. It was Blake, and his voice held an urgency she hadn't heard in a while. "Emily, can you meet me at Central Park?" he asked. "There's something important I need to tell you." She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. "What is it, Blake? You sound different." "I'd rather explain in person," he insisted gently. "It won't take long, I promise." Curiosity and concern got the better of her. "Okay, I'll be there in 30 minutes, she agreed, trying to keep her voice steady. The park was lively when Emily arrived, filled with people enjoying the early signs of spring. She spotted Blake standing near the Bethesda terrace, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. There was a seriousness in his posture, one that made Emily's heart pound with anticipation. "Thank you for coming," Blake said as she approached, his blue eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and nervous energy. "What's going on?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and worry. Blake took a deep breath, as if trying to gather the courage to speak. "I received news yesterday," he began slowly. "It's about the third brother, Luke." Emily's eyes widened. "What happened? Is he okay?" Blake's expression was heavy with emotion. "He's not okay, Emily," he admitted. "He's sick. He has been for a while, but he didn't want to tell me until now. It's serious. Terminal, actually." The words hit Emily like a punch to the chest, the air around them suddenly feeling colder. "Oh, Blake, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes brimming with sympathy. "I don't know what to do," Blake continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I only just found him, and now I'm losing him all over again. It feels like the universe is playing some cruel joke." Emily felt a surge of compassion, a deep ache for the man standing in front of her. Despite all the hurt and betrayal they had endured, she could see the genuine pain in Blake's eyes, the vulnerability of a man trying to come to terms with yet another loss. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. Blake shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just being here is enough," he said. You've always been the one person I felt I could be real with, even when I was trying to push you away." Emily reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm here, Blake. Whatever you need." Blake covered her hand with his own, and for a moment, it felt like time had paused around them. There was no past to haunt them, no future to fear. Just two people standing in the middle of Central Park, trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to break them. "I don't know how to make peace with all of this," Blake confessed quietly. "I thought finding my brothers would bring closure, but now it feels like I'm facing a different kind of goodbye." Emily's eyes softened, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe it's not about closure, Blake. Maybe it's about accepting that some things won't ever be fully resolved. But that doesn't mean they're not worth trying to mend." Blake nodded slowly, as if absorbing her words. "I want to be there for Luke, for as long as he has," he said. "But I also want to be honest with you, Emily. I know I've asked you for more than I deserve, but I can't pretend that my feelings for you have changed. If anything, they've only grown stronger." Emily's heart ached at his confession, torn between the remnants of the love they had shared and the reality of their fractured history. "Blake," she began carefully, "I can't deny that I still care about you, but I'm scared of getting hurt again. I don't know if I'm ready to risk everything, especially now, with all that's happening." Blake's eyes were filled with a mix of longing and acceptance. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't expect you to make any promises. I just wanted you to know how I feel, because I'm tired of hiding behind fear." For a long moment, they simply stood there, the silence between them filled with a sense of shared understanding. The city moved around them, joggers passing by, tourists taking photos, children laughing in the distance. But for Emily and Blake, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them, each trying to decide what came next. "I think we both need time," Emily said finally, her voice steady but filled with a deep honesty. "Time to figure out what we really want and what we're willing to risk for it." Blake nodded, a look of acceptance in his eyes. "I agree," he said. "But no matter what happens, I want you to know that you've changed me, Emily. You've made me want to be better, even if I don't know how to be that man yet." Emily felt a flicker of hope, tempered by the reality of their circumstances. "And you've made me stronger, Blake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even if it was through the hardest parts of my life." As they parted ways, there was no dramatic farewell, no promises of love rekindled. But there was a sense of possibility, a quiet hope that maybe, one day, they could find a way back to each other. This time, without the secrets and scars that had torn them apart. In the weeks that followed, Blake threw himself into supporting Luke. He flew to California frequently, helping with hospital visits and trying to make up for lost time. Emily, meanwhile, found solace in her writing, channeling her emotions into the pages of her next book. It wasn't about Blake this time. It was about survival, resilience, and the power of facing one's own fears. But the distance between them wasn't just physical. There was an unspoken understanding that they were both on separate journeys, each trying to heal old wounds and discover what truly mattered. Yet, the connection remained, a thread that wasn't quite severed, a possibility that lingered in the back of their minds. One evening, as Emily sat on her balcony, watching the sun set over the city, she received a message from Blake. "Thinking of you tonight. Hope you're doing okay." She smiled, her heart filled with a bittersweet warmth. Her reply was simple but honest. "Me too. Take care of yourself, Blake." And as the city lights began to twinkle, Emily felt a quiet sense of peace. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she had once imagined, but it was real, and it was enough for now. She knew that whatever happened next, it would be built on a foundation of truth, one that had taken them both years to uncover. Luke's condition deteriorated faster than expected. By early summer, it became clear that he had only a few months left. Blake Taylor, feeling the weight of time slipping away, spent almost every week flying between New York and California, trying to be present for a brother he barely knew yet felt deeply connected to. It was a cruel twist of fate. Just as he had found a piece of his lost past, he was losing it again. Emily Reed, back in New York, kept up with Blake through their phone calls and messages, though their conversations had shifted from personal reflections to updates about Luke's health. It was a strange limbo for her, supporting Blake from a distance, yet still unsure of her place in his life. Her new book was coming together, but the writing was slow, as if her emotions were tangled in the same uncertainty that defined her relationship with Blake. One evening, as Emily sat in her apartment, working on her manuscript, her phone rang. It was Blake. His voice, usually so controlled, was raw with emotion. "Emily," he said, sounding more vulnerable than she had ever heard him. "I need you. Can you come to California?" The urgency in his voice left no room for hesitation. "Of course," she replied, her heart aching at the thought of what he must be going through. "I'll be there as soon as I can." The next morning, Emily boarded a flight to San Francisco, her mind racing with a mix of anxiety and a strange sense of purpose. She knew this wasn't just about supporting Blake. It was about facing a reality that had become as much hers as his. The flight felt both too long and too short, giving her time to think, but not enough to truly process what awaited her. When she arrived at the small hospital in Marin County, Blake was waiting for her in the lobby. He looked exhausted, his face lined with worry and sleepless nights. As soon as he saw Emily, he pulled her into a tight embrace, his body trembling with the weight of unspoken emotions. "Thank you for coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Of course," Emily said, holding him close. "I'm here for you, Blake. Whatever you need." They stood like that for a moment, the hospital's sterile lights casting a harsh glow over them. There were no grand declarations, just a shared understanding of the gravity of the situation. "Luke wants to meet you," Blake said softly, pulling back slightly to look at her. "I told him about you, about us. He's curious to know the person who made me face my own demons." Emily felt a surge of emotion, a mix of honor and apprehension. "I'd be happy to meet him," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Blake led her down the hall to Luke's room. The sight of him was both heartbreaking and humbling. A man in his early 30s, lying in a hospital bed, his body frail but his eyes still bright with a quiet strength. Despite the tubes and monitors surrounding him, there was a calmness in Luke's demeanor that suggested a peace Emily couldn't quite understand. "Luke, this is Emily," Blake said, his voice filled with tenderness. "Emily, this is my brother." Luke managed a weak smile, his eyes filled with curiosity. "So, you're the writer," he said, his voice raspy but warm. "I've heard a lot about you." Emily smiled back, feeling a strange sense of connection. "And I've heard a lot about you too," she replied. "It's good to finally meet you." The three of them spent the next hour talking, the conversation drifting between stories of the past and reflections on the present. Luke's humor was sharp, even in his weakened state, and he seemed genuinely interested in Emily's work and her relationship with Blake. Despite the circumstances, there was a surprising sense of warmth in the room, a glimpse of the family bond that had been lost for so long. As the days passed, Emily stayed by Blake's side, offering whatever support she could. She wasn't just there for him. She found herself caring deeply for Luke, drawn to his courage and resilience. It was a strange, bittersweet experience, sharing these final moments with someone she had only just met but felt intrinsically connected to through Blake. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Blake and Emily found themselves alone in a small garden outside the hospital. The night was quiet, the stars visible through a clear California sky. Blake's face was etched with grief, and Emily sensed that he was nearing a breaking point. "I don't know how to let go," Blake said suddenly, his voice breaking. "I just found him, and now I have to say goodbye. It feels so unfair." Emily reached for his hand, her own eyes filled with tears. "It is unfair," she agreed softly. "But you're here, Blake. You're giving him the love and support he's needed all these years. That's what matters now." Blake turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability. "I couldn't have done this without you, Emily," he admitted. "You're the one who made me face everything I've been running from. You're the reason I found Luke at all." Emily's heart ached at his words, a mix of love and sadness that was almost overwhelming. "I just wanted you to find peace," she said, "even if it meant facing the hardest truths." Blake's gaze softened, and for the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I know," he said quietly, And I think, somehow, you're helping me find it. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, difficult conversations, and moments of unexpected joy. Luke's condition continued to worsen, but he remained lucid, often sharing stories with Blake and Emily that painted a picture of a life filled with both hardship and moments of grace. On a warm afternoon in late June, Luke's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. The doctors warned Blake that the end was near, and the family gathered to say their final goodbyes. Blake stayed by Luke's side, holding his hand, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for finding me," Luke whispered weakly, his voice barely audible. "I always hoped, but I never thought." Blake leaned in, his voice choked with emotion. "I love you, Luke," he said, his words raw and filled with pain. "I'm sorry it took so long." Luke managed a faint smile, his eyes filled with acceptance. "You're here now," he said. "That's all that matters." Luke passed away peacefully that night, surrounded by love, something he had been deprived of for so long. Blake was devastated, his grief overwhelming, but there was also a sense of closure, a feeling that he had finally done right by his brother, even if it had come too late. In the days that followed, Blake and Emily remained in California, processing the loss together. There was no rush to return to their lives in New York. For now, they simply needed to be present, to grieve and to heal. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of a small hotel overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Blake reached for Emily's hand. "I don't know what happens next," he said honestly, "but I know that I don't want to face it alone." Emily's eyes were filled with tears, but there was also a quiet strength in her expression. "Neither do I," she said softly, "but I think, maybe, we're finally ready to try." Blake pulled her closer, his embrace filled with a tenderness that spoke of both past regrets and future hopes. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. It was messy and imperfect, but it was built on a foundation of truth and shared pain. As the sun set over the ocean, they sat in silence, letting the waves carry away the remnants of old wounds. There were no promises of forever, but there was an understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a sense of peace, a feeling that perhaps, after everything, they had found their way back to each other, stronger, wiser, and ready to start anew. In the months that followed Luke's death, Blake and Emily slowly returned to New York, each carrying a different kind of heaviness in their hearts. The grief lingered, but so did a sense of hard-won closure. Blake had reconciled with the ghosts of his past, and Emily, for the first time, felt that she had truly helped someone find a piece of their lost self. The city seemed different now, less overwhelming and more welcoming, as if it were acknowledging the changes within them. Emily settled back into her routine, finding solace in her writing once more. She knew she had a new story to tell, not just about heartbreak or redemption, but about resilience in the face of unexpected loss. Blake, on the other hand, was determined to make significant changes in his life. He stepped back from the intensity of his business ventures, delegating more responsibilities to his trusted executives. It was a surprising shift for a man who had once been defined by his relentless ambition, but Blake was no longer driven by the same compulsions. His priorities had shifted. One crisp October morning, as Emily sat at a cafe revising the final chapters of her latest manuscript, she received a text from Blake. "Meet me at the bench near Bow Bridge. I have something I need to share with you, ." Emily's heart fluttered with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. It had been weeks since they'd had a truly meaningful conversation. Life had pulled them in different directions as they tried to make sense of who they were, both individually and together. But she knew this meeting felt different, that it carried a sense of finality, or perhaps a new beginning. When Emily arrived at Central Park, she found Blake sitting on the bench they had often visited during the early days of their secret relationship. The leaves around them were vibrant with autumn colors, creating a picturesque scene that seemed almost poetic in its simplicity. Blake stood as she approached, his eyes bright but serious. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Of course," Emily replied, taking a seat beside him. "What's on your mind?" Blake took a deep breath, his gaze steady but filled with emotion. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began. About everything, us, my family, the choices I've made. And I realized something that I need to say, not just for your sake, but for mine. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her emotions a complex mix of hope and apprehension. Go on, she urged gently. Blake's expression was earnest, his words deliberate. I know I've hurt you deeply, more than once, he said, and I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry, not just for how I left, but for how I failed to see the depth of what we had. Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I believe you, she said quietly, and I've had to come to terms with my own part in it too. I used my writing as a way to protect myself, to keep you at a distance, even when I still cared. Blake nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. We've both changed, Emily, he said, but the truth is, I still love you. I know that might sound selfish, given everything that's happened, but it's the most honest thing I can say right now. Emily's breath caught in her throat, the words landing with a force she hadn't expected. Part of her wanted to leap into his arms, to reclaim the love that had once burned so brightly between them. But another part, the one that had learned from heartbreak, urged caution. I still love you too, Blake, she admitted, her voice steady but filled with vulnerability. But I need to know that this time, it's real. I can't go through the same cycle again. Blake reached for her hand, his grip warm and firm. I don't want to repeat the past either, he said. I want something different, something honest. I know we can't erase what's happened, but I think we can build something stronger if we're both willing to try. Emily looked into his eyes, seeing a sincerity that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the desperate, possessive love of their early days. It was something deeper, grounded in the pain and growth they had experienced separately and together. I'm willing to try, she said softly, but I need us to take it slow, to really understand each other this time. Blake's face broke into a relieved smile. Slow is fine with me, he agreed. I just want to be with you, Emily, in whatever way that means. No more secrets, no more running. The two sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the leaves fall around them, carried by a gentle breeze. It was a moment of clarity, not a fairy tale ending, but the beginning of something new. An uncertain path, but one they were ready to walk together, step by cautious step. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Blake slowly rebuilt their relationship. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, flashes of old wounds that resurfaced unexpectedly. But they faced each challenge with honesty, allowing themselves to be vulnerable in a way they had never been before. They began to create new memories, ones untainted by past mistakes. One evening, as they sat together in Emily's apartment, Blake handed her a small envelope. What's this? She asked, curiosity piqued. Just open it, he said, a playful smile tugging at his lips. Inside was a handwritten note. Let's write our next chapter together, one day at a time. Emily looked up, tears of joy in her eyes. Are you sure? She asked, her voice filled with both hope and disbelief. Blake nodded. More than ever, he said. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you. For the first time in years, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. She knew their journey wasn't over. It was simply evolving. The love they had found again was different now. Less impulsive, more resilient. It was a love born not out of fantasy, but from the reality of two flawed people choosing each other despite everything. As they sat together that night, the city's lights twinkling outside the window, there were no grand promises, no declarations of a perfect happily ever after. But there was love, real and imperfect, built on a foundation of honesty and redemption. And that, Emily realized, was more than enough. It was everything she had ever truly wanted.